in the United States, and a lot of it is centered around the need for EPA approval of your injection wells, this Class 6 type well. A couple states, including yours, have primacy, which is wonderful, and it allows you to take that approval in state. But many don't, and the process for gaining primacy is slow, and the Class 6 well approval process is unclear, at least in terms of results so far. And until we have clarity on the cadence of those Class 6 approvals and have emitters see a view towards what can actually be sanctioned now that you know you have a destination for your CO2, that's a challenge that needs to be solved. On the other end of the spectrum, and it goes along with what Vicki and Justin were saying, carbon capture is a new thing for most people. And there can be, and people get what they get from their news or their web feeds. And I get the sense that some people think that we're putting CO2 a couple 100 feet underground and it's gonna come bubbling up through a lake. I don't think the public fully realizes, and to a large degree, it needs to be on us to educate the communities where we are about just what we're doing, and that this is CO2 that's 2 miles underground, or give or take, and it's not coming back out. And just to help people understand how good this is, and the jobs and opportunities that decarbonizing whatever industry you're working with, what opportunities are created by that can help that whole community?
You brought up a great topic, which was permitting and timeframes, because we all know, everybody in this room knows that capital is attracted to stable tax and regulatory environments, and it runs away when it's uncertain. And I know you've written letters and supported trying to get a Class 6 injection well in Louisiana, and how many years are you into that, and what's the forecast?
So interestingly, we're maybe, for our longest permit, we're about a year into it, and the EPA's stated timeline is 2 years, and so far all the signals that we get from the EPA are very positive, but we need to see the final result.
Let me know if it gets approved before the next election.
Right.
Somehow there's a lot of things that are being pushed out past November of 2024. But I would say in North Dakota, of course, where you mentioned we've got primacy. Wyoming is the other state, 2 states where we can, that I think we're down to 6 to 7 months now for getting a permit for a Class 6 well in North Dakota. And then I mentioned this morning, of course, pooling. We created in state law that the landowner owns that microscopic pore space where the CO2 is stored. That's how we can get to 90% approval. I mean, one of those 32 square miles, all those landowners saying, yes, we want to get a mailbox check for that CO2 storage. And then the third thing, which no other state has done, which is we put in a indemnification fund. So when someone's injecting, like these 2 ethanol plants that have already begun and coal plants in the future and others, when they're injecting, they pay a little bit into that fund, and they pay for every ton they inject into a state fund. Then they're responsible for that injection well in the storage for 10 years after they're done injecting. At that point, it reverts back to the state, because when they pass these 45Q payments to, I'd say, to get Manchin's vote, then they immediately launched the EPA and the SEC to make sure that nobody could use them. We're not going to permit any wells, and we're also going to make sure that the SEC sticks everybody with a permanent liability for every ton of CO2 you stored. So we've basically been playing jujitsu with the federal government in North Dakota, and we've solved the pooling problem, we've solved the permitting problem, and we've solved the liability problem. And that's why now there's over $40 billion of capital trying to come to North Dakota attached to projects related to CO2 or EOR. And then you mentioned Charlie Gorecki, our great team here from UND, the Environmental Research and Energy and Environmental Research Center at the University of North Dakota. They've been leaders on CO2 research for over 20 years. Charlie, raise your hand back there. If others, go flock on him. If you got anybody else that's here. I see Mac McKellen from Minnesota. They're one of the people that are permitting storage there. Raise your hand, Mac, the CEO. These guys are doing cutting edge work. Talk to them. We'd love to share anything that we got going on in North Dakota to help anybody else move forward in this industry. So with that, I just want to give lightning round closing comments, starting with you, Justin. Future of carbon management storage in the United States.
Well, I guess maybe I'd just focus on kind of the supply chain and the connection between ag and renewable energy and fossil energy. So if you think about kind of the life cycle of what we're doing, you've got a corn plant in Iowa that sucks up carbon, that goes to an ethanol plant, that gets fermented into low carbon ethanol that can then be blended with fossil aviation fuel in terms of SAF. That carbon can then be shipped to North Dakota, put underground, or longer term be used for enhanced oil recovery to increase oil production in a more efficient way. So I think just the long-term nature of how we think about this and the benefits it's going to have for a variety of industries is pretty powerful to us.
I agree, and I would say that certainly energy independence has to be top of mind, and we have to garner more support from the industry and expand this out to other companies within our industry. I think that would be helpful as well.
For me, when I look around this room and I see friends in the upstream and midstream spaces and even the downstream spaces, what I will tell you is that the toolkit that you build in your company, whether it is building and operating pipelines, drilling, completing and operating wells, modeling subsurface, everything around your business, land, there is a perfect adjacency to CCUS. You have the toolkit to do this. And to me, it's one of the most exciting things about this industry. I see Paul Johnson from Colorado School of Mines back there, and we've talked about even the challenges that our institutions have of bringing in those specialties into the schools these days. And this is an adjacency where you can make a difference in carbon capture, learning the same skills that you use in upstream oil and gas. It's a beautiful thing for our industry. It's technology that exists today. We just need to lean in.
So in closing, I would just say a challenge to this whole group here today is I would say that as an industry, misinformation is some days beating information. Vicki talked about the math. Justin talked about getting infrastructure built on sequestration, but then we can flip it to EOR down the road. Sharing the numbers that we aren't going to have enough CO2. North Dakota, what I tell folks there is, look, if you're against oil and gas industry and everything it's done for our state and for the nation, global stability, if you're against baseload power energy and having stable power and stable grid in our country, and if you're against agriculture, then you can be against the CO2 management industry. If you want to be against those three things, that's our whole state, and it's actually the future of our country, is making sure we've got the power and we've got the food and the fuel to feed ourselves and our allies. And so this has to be part of the equation. So I applaud the pioneers, Harold Hamm and others that have invested with Summit, Occidental, Denbury, what you guys are doing to lead the way. I know it's not popular, but the challenge to all of us is we got to get better at getting the information out, because some days it feels like the misinformation is winning on all aspects of this industry, and I think collectively we can turn that around as well. If we turned around every story that I had when I was in high school, we're going to run out of energy and run out of food, that went up and down about 3 times as recently as the early 2000s. We're going to run out, and then now we talked about, hey, we've tripled it. If this industry can do that, we ought to be able to put our heads together and think about how do we actually communicate, because it's one of the things that we run into all the time. And I think, but one of the places it starts is we got to have a change in leadership in Washington, D.C. in November of 2024, because that's the bully pulpit that's going to help describe the power and the benefit of this industry. And so again, thank you all. Let's give it up for our amazing, awesome panel. And thank you all. Let's go.
Okay, thank you so much for the carbon capture panel. Our next topic is American energy as a driver of economic prosperity. We want to thank the Lenormand companies for sponsoring this next panel. Please welcome the Ham Institute for American Energy Distinguished Fellow, Steve Moore.
Well, good afternoon, folks. It's unfortunate my good pal Steve Forbes was not able to come, so I'm going to give you a little panoramic view about what's going on in the economy. This has been an incredible conference. Again, Harold, I salute you. And I also wanted to do a quick shout out, if I could, to someone who really made this conference possible, and that's Kristen Thomas. Kristen, you've done amazing, amazing work to put this thing together. really, and I just got, Harold, do you mind if I tell a quick story about Kristen and how I first met you? Because I always tell the story that I'm the one who made Harold Hamm famous, because I was 10 years at the Wall Street Journal on the editorial board, and this woman from Oklahoma just kept calling me, the biggest pest I ever met, Harold. I mean, I think she called me like 7 times. You gotta meet Harold Hamm. And I don't know who Harold Hamm is. I don't care about Harold Hamm. I'm busy. I'm working for the Wall Street Journal. Well, you know, over and over and over, she just pestered me. And so finally I said, okay, look, next time you're in Washington, D.C., we'll go over, you know, across the street to the Mortons and we'll have lunch. And you know, frankly, I didn't really want to get together with Harold Hamm, but she was persistent. And so Harold came over, we had lunch. It turned into a 3-hour lunch. And it was one of those meetings that just changes your life, because Harold was telling me this story that no one in America knew, which is that we were at the beginning of an energy revolution. And I'm listening to Harold talk about this, and it was like a reporter and a journalist's dream, because I had a story that no one else had, that we were at the beginning of a renaissance in energy that was going to blow people away. And so I wrote the column, a long column. It was the most read column in the Wall Street Journal that year, for a full year, about Harold Hamm. And I think we called it, I used your phrase, that America was now Saudi, what do we call it? Saudi America. And so it was an amazing story. And of course, you know, in the last 12 years, something happened that nobody thought was possible, that the United States of America tripled our oil and gas output. Think about that, at a time when everyone was saying we're running out of oil and gas. So, Kristen, thank you for being persistent, because that was an amazing, amazing article. So I want to tell you a little bit about what's going on with the economy very quickly, and then if we have time, I'll take some questions. So let me start with, how do I do this? Okay, so let me give you the big picture. You've been talking about energy all day, and it's been an amazing story, but I want to talk about more broadly what's happened with the economy over the last 40 years, because I think, you know, the best way to know what's coming is to see what's happened in the past. And so this is a chart of the stock market, and the blue line is a standard S&P 500 stock market. Most of you in this room are investors, and you know this story. You can see the incredible bull market expansion. What's interesting about this chart, which my buddy Art Laffer put together, is if you inflation adjust the returns for stocks, which as investors you all know, when you make an investment, you're interested in your after inflation, not your before inflation return. You can see that in the 1970s, during the era of Nixon, Ford, and Carter, when we had very, very high inflation and very, very high tax rates, we had the biggest bear market since the Great Depression. So stocks lost, adjusted to inflation, from 1968 to 1982, 60% of their value in real terms. That's a pretty ferocious bear market. And then you can see what happened starting in the early 1980s. The way that my buddy Art Laffer likes to say is that the clouds disperse, the sun came out, and God gave America Ronald Reagan. And you can see this massive expansion in what happened to the value of stocks. And really, it's been for the most part, a 40 to 50-year bull market that we've seen. We've seen in the United States the greatest, in the history of the world, the greatest wealth creation period ever in the last 40 years. And you can see, you know, we've had some ups and downs, but for the most part, this rocket just keeps flying into the orbit. And I'm here to tell you, I'm going to show you some negative things about the economy, but Fred Smith and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, about the incredible advances. I mean, we had the technology age with the internet, but I really do believe we're in the second stages now of this, and you've been hearing all day today about the new advances in energy, but when you talk about artificial intelligence, robotics, what's going on with genetic therapy and so on, this is going to be a golden age. I wish I could live another 50 years to see the advances that are coming. So I really do believe that, the American stock market is the place to be. It's the single best place to invest your money, period. Now, notwithstanding that, let me show you the things that worry me. So this is something that is incredibly frightening to me, It is the massive increase in our national debt that's happened that began with COVID. And you can see, the president that I work for, Donald Trump, he spent a lot of money during COVID when, by the way, I don't know how many of you agree with me, I think that one of the single greatest catastrophes of our country is what happened during COVID and shutting down our schools and our churches and our businesses. We should never, never, never allow that to happen again. And what worries me about this fascination with climate change is I think they're going to try the same kind of mechanisms of shutting down our economy with climate change as they did with COVID. By the way, the evidence is crystal clear that lockdowns had zero effect in terms of reducing the infection rate and reducing the death rate. Lockdowns were a complete failure. And yet you can see we kept spending more and more money. And then Biden came in and he spent $6 trillion more. There's an old saying from Rahm Emanuel, who's a big Democratic politico, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And this is exactly what happened. When Biden came in, COVID was over. We had the vaccine, all of the dangers of COVID were coming to an end. So we didn't actually need to spend more money. We actually needed to start spending less money. And yet they use this as an excuse to spend these multiple numbers of bills. And you can see, by the way, for the first time in American history, in 2020, this was the only time in American history where the government actually consumed more of the GDP than our entire private sector. Let's pray that, in other words, in 2020, we were officially a socialist country, where the government was larger than all private sector output. Now that number is down, that's the good news, but we're still at about 38%, and that's way too high. The government should be consuming about 25%, so we have a huge excess burden of government right now. These are the spending bills that we've done in the last 3 years, and you can see they just keep adding up and up and up and up. The Blue State Bailout Bill, the Green New Deal, the Corporate Welfare Bill, on and on and on and on and on. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because, first of all, we have, how many of you in this room ever saw the movie that came out about a year or two ago called Don't Look Up? Did any of you watch that movie? It was a pretty funny movie. It was actually really funny, except it had this morality play at the end of the, it's about a meteor that's going to hit the Earth, and everybody's denying that it's coming, and it's not really going to hit the Earth, but of course it is headed to the Earth, and it's a morality play for climate change, right? Oh my God, we have to do, no. What I'm here to tell you is we actually do have a crisis that's hitting America, and it ain't climate change. The crisis that America has to deal with right now is this massive increase in our national debt, which, as you can see, is headed to 200% of GDP. That will bankrupt the country if we do it. Now, the reason I like to show this graph is if you look at it, you can see that we've had many periods of crisis in American history, starting with the founding of our country when we fought and won the the Revolutionary War, and then you can see what happened was when the Revolutionary War was over, we actually started paying down the debt. And then the Civil War, we took on major amounts of debt, and guess what? We paid down the debt. After World War I, the same thing, we paid down the debt. Same thing after the Great Depression, World War II. Look at how much the debt came down after World War II. Now look at what's happened since the pandemic. And by the way, those are the projections after the pandemic. This is the first time in American history in a recovery from a crisis where we're running massive amounts of debt. In other words, we shouldn't be running a $2 trillion deficit right now. In a sane world, we'd be actually running a surplus to pay off the amount of money that we borrowed, and this is no end in sight. And so is that scary to me? It sure as hell is. Okay, now why are people so angry? Why is there so much kind of rage and anger and with respect, Biden says the economy is doing so well, and yet the polls have shown consistently, whether it's ABC or Fox or Pew, every poll shows 70% of Americans think the economy is headed in the wrong direction and that their personal finances are getting worse. Now, why is that? Well, this picture shows exactly why. The top blue line is the Consumer Price Index, and the bottom line is average hourly earnings made by Americans. Guess what? In 22 of the last 24 months, Americans' wages have fallen behind consumer prices. What does that mean? We're getting poorer. That is, the middle class is feeling the effect of this high inflation. Now, the good news is the inflation has come down a lot from its peak of 9%, but I don't believe we're out of the inflation woods yet. This is something I'm proud of as a guy who worked with Trump. We increased real median household income by cutting taxes, reducing regulation, promoting American energy. All of these policies of putting America first increased middle class wages and salaries and incomes by $6,500. By the way, that's a spectacular amount of improvement in family incomes in only 4 years. It's a miracle, actually, that we were able to achieve that. Now, contrast that with what's happening under Biden, people are feeling poor. So policy does matter. I thought you'd find this kind of interesting because so many of you are involved in the financial markets and so on. So this is what happened with inflation, the black line. And those, you see those dotted lines? I looked at all of the top economists on Wall Street and all the big predictors and the people who are supposed to be geniuses on the economy. And these were the rates, these were the inflation rates they predicted. Why does anybody listen to Wall Street economists? They're wrong, wrong, wrong so many times. By the way, there were 8 Nobel Prize economists at the end of 2021, you can look this up, who wrote a major letter in the New York Times, jointly signed letter saying, don't worry, Biden's policies won't cause inflation. Now, don't you think those people may have wanted to, give their Nobel Prizes back? I mean, how do you make such a big mistake? Now, I want to show you this graph because the good news about this graph, these are the Biden proposals of taxes that Biden wanted to impose when he was elected. And the good news about this graph is that we were able to defeat every one of these. These did not happen. It's one of the things, thank God, none of these tax increases happened. But they wanted to raise the corporate tax, they wanted to raise the personal income tax rate, they wanted to raise the income and payroll tax, they wanted to raise capital gains tax. They also want to get rid of, they want to tax unrealized capital gains, which would be a catastrophe for the country, and they wanted to raise the death tax. Now, that didn't happen, but I'm here to tell you, if things go badly for the Republicans in 2024, and I think there's about a 1 in 3 chance the Democrats could run the table, then this will happen. This will happen. And Fred, you'll see tax rates on investment go up as high as 60 to 70%, which would be a really bad thing for economic growth and for capital investment in the United States. This is just the Art Laffer chart, and I love to show this because I do believe, I'm a supply-sider, when you cut tax rates, good things happen. The brown line is the tax rate in the United States over the last 50 years. Remember, during Jimmy Carter, the highest tax rate was 70%. Reagan came in, cut it from 70 to 50 to 28%. And then look at what happened. The green line is the revenues. This Laffer curve really works. You cut tax rates, good things happen, and you can see that the amount, look, up, even though the rates were lower. And by the way, at the tail end of that, you can see the Trump tax cut of 2019. That was the one, Fred, you were talking about this morning. We actually had a big jump up in revenue because the economy performed so well in that period. We cut the corporate rate, not because we thought it was important, we love corporations, but we were putting America in a competitive disadvantage. You can see those blue pillars are the average tax rate of all the countries that America competes with, and the black dotted line was the US chart, and you can see at one point we were at about 20 percentage point disadvantage, which is a pretty un-American. Talk about putting America last. That put us, we had the highest corporate tax rate in the world. We cut those rates, and guess what? It really had a big impact. We brought in about $2 trillion of capital as a result. Okay, now let me just quickly focus on the situation with energy. And by the way, this is a room of energy experts, so I'm going to just keep this very simple and kind of amplify the message that you've already heard. You can see with the green line, Harold, that is the shale revolution that happened, where we went from 4 million barrels to 12 million barrels in, what was that, in about 12 years. I mean, nobody would have predicted that, by the way. If you had said in 2006 the United States was going to triple its oil output, you would have been thrown right off the stage, and yet it did happen. And what's so cool about this chart is you can see that, and by the way, Trump was all in on American energy, no question about it. He wanted to drill, baby, drill. He wanted every possible barrel of oil that we could produce and all the natural gas and coal we could produce. And what was really interesting is that by 2019, the United States actually surpassed the amount of oil and gas production of Saudi Arabia and Russia. That's pretty amazing. I mean, and we became, for the first time, the world leader in production. Incidentally, in those 3 or 4 years that Trump was president, how many times did we talk about OPEC? Nobody talked about OPEC because you can't have a cartel when the #1 producer in the world isn't part of your cartel. So we really brought OPEC to its knees. And what's really so distressing right now is that green line that goes straight down, that effectively, that is net zero. This is the agenda of the left today, to go to zero on American fossil fuel production. That is a catastrophe. You could, if you wanted to invent something to destroy the American economy, you couldn't come up with something, you know, that would do more damage than destroying our energy supply. Now, I thought I'd show you this because Casey Mulligan, who's a top economist at the University of Chicago, works with me. We did an analysis of what if we just stayed on the Trump baseline of oil and gas production. In other words, where would we be today? And we estimate we'd be producing about 3 million more barrels a day if we just, you know, allowed the energy industry to do what it does. So we're down 3 million barrels a day from where we should be. OPEC and Russia have caused an increase in the gas price because they've cut production. OPEC, I think, was at 1 million, and Russia cut their production by about 500,000. My point of this is we wouldn't be talking about, you know, $4 and $5 a gallon gasoline today if we just stuck with the policies that we had in place. So that's just a dramatic example of how this war on American energy is having a negative effect already on American consumers. One of the things that, you know, this has been such a fascinating conversation today about the whole situation with climate change, and I would simply say this, that the one point that we need to stress more than just about any other point is, let's say that every single policy that the green energy groups wanted to put in place, every single one of them was put in place for the United States. And let's say we even went to zero carbon emissions. We shut down all American fossil fuels. The impact that would have on global climate change, climate emissions would be negligible because China's pollution levels are 4 times higher than ours are. And you can see, you know, I'm very pro-coal, by the way. We haven't really talked about coal, but America does have the cleanest coal, and this country was built on coal. Every time we shut down a clean coal plant in the United States, China is building 5 new coal plants. So how in the world is that going to reduce the world temperature if China is emitting all these? In fact, their coal production will simply go up every time we reduce it. Okay, a couple more points. This is something that's not emphasized enough. And this is, by the way, these numbers are before we did the big bill last year, the green energy bill. Wind and solar are getting subsidies that are 20 to 50 to 100 times the rate of any subsidy that the fossil fuel industry gets. So, we got to get rid of the oil and gas subsidies. Well, number one, what subsidies are they talking about? Number two, if there are subsidies, they are minuscule compared to what the green energy industry gets. By the way, I don't know how many of you know this, but in the budget right now, it's already been appropriated. There is a $380 billion green energy slush fund. I didn't say million, I said billion. Anybody in this room know who runs the $380 billion green energy slush fund from the White House? A guy by the name of John Podesta. Now, John Podesta is a really smart political guy. He ran the Obama campaign, and he's one of the smartest political guys I've ever met. He knows nothing about energy, nothing. And he is running a and where is all that money going to go? Obviously, it's going to go to Democratic cronies and left-wing special interest groups and the green energy groups. So that's something to be, I think, contented with. I do believe that this is going to be an important election season. I think it's going to be a real conflict of visions. You heard Nikki Haley talk today. I thought she was spot on about what, our energy policy should be. And so, the consequences are great, but if things go right, if we get back to the kind of policies we had in place 4 years ago, I'm going to say to you, I think we're going to see an incredible boom in this country. I feel it coming, and that's why I showed you that first chart. When you get the policies in line, you see the biggest boom you ever saw, and I really believe it's coming. So I will stop there. I think we have time for 2 or 3 questions, and so if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm happy to entertain them. Kind of a stunned silence. Yes, sir. Uh-oh, Myron.
These are the most efficient and therefore the cleanest. We have in this country one ultra supercritical coal plant. So they are replacing their old, somewhat old, dirty coal plants with very clean coal plants. We are now reliant on coal plants that are 50, 60 years old, and we're not building any new ones. So I think it's misleading to call it pollution if it's CO2 emissions. China is cleaning up its air in the same way that the United States did in a previous generation. And they are doing it now with coal.
Well, look, I'm pro-coal. I mean, coal is an incredibly efficient way to get electric power. I think we're making a big, big mistake, Myron, in shutting down our coal plants all over the country. You know, when you've had these polar vortexes and other problems where, you know, the solar panels freeze and the windmills aren't turning and so on, what happens is that you need to have coal as a backup energy source, just as a precaution against all these problems. I want to, my time is up, I'll just make one point, that a lot of people don't understand. Let me just show you one final chart. That, you know, for all the talk about America being, you know, responsible for all the problems in the world and that we're the biggest carbon emitter and so on, and the biggest polluter, it simply isn't true. And this is a chart that I bet if you went into a grade school or you went into a college, or even if you went into Harvard and asked the kids, do you think that the air that we breathe today is cleaner or dirtier than it was 50 years ago? And I've done this, even at the top universities of the country. 80% of these kids think that the air was cleaner 50 years ago than it is today. They have no idea. They actually think the water was cleaner 50 years ago that we drink today than 50 years ago. And of course, that isn't true. You can see every major pollutant has been cut, and these are real pollutions. Nobody dies from carbon dioxide, but you can get sick from carbon monoxide, from sulfur, from lead, and all these others. We've reduced our pollution levels by about 80%, even as the United States economy has grown fivefold. So that's an amazing achievement. We can be a country that is economically superior, and we can cut our emissions at the same time. Okay, folks, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. That was great. It's now my pleasure to reintroduce Harold Hamm, Executive Chairman of Continental Resources and obviously Chairman of the Hamm Institute for American Energy. We thought this next discussion, we needed Harold to kick it off. Harold?
Yeah, thank you very much. April 23rd, 2020 will go down history as a day of infamy in our industry when crude oil traded at a negative price of $37.63. And nobody ever forget that. And it's blamed on a perceived lack of oil storage at Cushing, Oklahoma, as demand was projected to dry up, as it did, with COVID-19. But that trading event cost an estimated $5 billion for that single one day. And as a producer, I knew we had to establish a reliable market without a threat of storage disruption in the future. And that market existed on the Gulf Coast. We're all aware of what that could be. As long as another ship could pull up, we'd never run out of storage. So we had to solve that problem. So under the purview of antitrust lawyers, we established an industry best practices group called AGS, American Gulf Coast Select, we called it initially. And we got a marker established by both Platts and Argus later for trading purposes for that marker. So over the next several months, arrangements by major crude oil gatherers were made to represent this market at Houston and deliver oil to underpin trades. And we changed it, AGS, back to HOU. So today this symbol represents a growing market tied to the Brent world oil trading market. And as long as, like I say, another ship can pull up, We never have to run out of storage capacity again. So anyway, this is a very important panel to talk about this new market and that our America's global oil market tied to Brent. So thank you very much. I'll turn it back.
Okay, let me introduce our panelists. The topic of this panel is the evolving global oil market, America's new global barrel. We want to thank our friends at Select Water for sponsoring this discussion. Our first panelist serves as the Vice President and Global Head of Oil Markets for ICE. Please welcome Jeff Barbudo. Our next panelist is the Senior Vice President, Crude Oil and Pipelines and Terminals for Enterprise Products. Welcome, James Banney. And also joining the discussion is Magellan Midstream Partners Vice President of Crude Oil, Commercial and Marketing. Welcome, Blake Vaughn. All right, here's where I do a little magic. I'm gonna just slip right over here and do this one. Thank you guys for joining us. We're excited about this. I think the lead-in on today is so much the world knows, we hope the world understands the revolution that happened in U.S. production between horizontal drilling and fracking. But we had a problem with our plumbing in the United States, right? For so long we had been dependent on foreign oil. And suddenly, as the system started producing all this oil, we realized, uh-oh, we need to do some work to get this right. I think people understand one of the great breakthroughs of the last 10 years was what happened to reverse the oil export ban. And so we started moving oil internationally. But as Mr. Ham just mentioned, we discovered a real problem in April 2020 when oil suddenly went negative. Jeff, could I just start with you from your perspective at ICE? Tell us about what happened that day. Give us the mechanics, some of the forces at work.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Harold, for having us. It's an honor. So on April 20th, or April 2020, COVID lockdowns really started to crush energy demand. And we were in a position where we had a domestic benchmark that was based in Cushing, Oklahoma, with limited storage, 90 million barrels of storage, and it got exposed again for being a sort of antiquated marker. I mean, it was designed 40 years ago when the U.S. was primarily an importer, and on April 20th we saw what could happen, right? So there were 90 million barrels of storage. 15 were available for lease at the time, and they were all spoken for. And as more and more crude built up and some futures positions were still on the market, we saw the situation which had previously been unthinkable of negative $37 crude oil.
So you mentioned the 90 million barrels at Cushing. Maybe, James, I could just ask you, and Blake jump in, but just contrast for a minute the total amount of storage in Cushing and what's available when you get down to the Gulf Coast. You've got storage, Magellan has storage, and then there's pipelines and all kinds of ways to store oil. Give us a sense of the scope of the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, I think when we compare what Magellan and Enterprise brings to bear along the Houston market, just between our two companies, we're talking around 65 million barrels of storage. But when you layer in, call it the PADD 3 storage, you're in excess of 400 million, approaching 500. So the access to storage, but it's more than just a storage question at the end of the day. It's also, and I think Harold, you alluded to this, is that, we have access to docks, that it's an instant relief valve for barrels that need to get out of the system.
Blake, anything you'd add?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is just, outbound capacity exceeds inbound capacity into Houston, and then those numbers that Jay was referencing there don't include any of the floating storage that you would have access to that would further solve the problem that we saw in Cushing that day.
So, Jeff, maybe just replay a little bit of the history here, because creating this new delivery point, having volume around that delivery point, you're now working with customers so that they can forward sell and use that delivery point. Talk about how it's going and how the product is developing and why it's helping your customers.
Sure. So, the problems at Cushing weren't new. April 2020 was just sort of the latest example. In around 2015, we saw Cushing trade, as much as $20 below the Gulf Coast. So there were supply gluts that were later relieved with physical infrastructure. So around 2018, ICE and Magellan started working together to come up with a futures contract design on the Gulf Coast with outlets to the international demand via the water, ample storage, plus in the refining capital of the U.S. in Houston. So when April 2020 happened, I saw Harold on CNBC and managed to get in contact and told him that we were working on a project on the side to create something in the Gulf Coast that solved some of these issues. And we were lacking the scale. It was just Magellan and ICE. And Magellan's a very prominent pricing point in the Gulf Coast, but we needed access to additional customers and multiple systems. And Harold was really instrumental in bringing Enterprise into the fold, at which point we went, I'll let these guys go through the physical stats, but it really expanded the product for us. And today, it's really taking off. We can get into Brent later.
Yeah.
Enterprise likewise had tried to start a contract on its own sole accord in the Houston area. Similar end result is it just didn't have the size and scale that I think the two companies combined can offer.
Could we talk about that, because it's quite unique, and Mr. Ham referenced it, but Enterprise and Magellan working together to, along with ICE's help, to create a singular type market, and you had to have the antitrust lawyers and all those types of things. Just talk to us a little bit about that process. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, when I started in the crude space in, call it 2011, my biggest interactions with Magellan were on disputes of some nature or another. And so, it just goes to show, Harold stepping in and really pushing us, Enterprise that is, to believe in the size and scale of both companies coming together. I think that went a long way in where we are today. So thanks.
Blake, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is just that us coming together was something that our joint customers wanted, and Harold hit on it with, the AGS task force that was comprised of a lot of the folks that do a lot of business on both of our systems, and so we were reacting to what our customers wanted.
So I think when you think about this panel in the context of our day today, so much of today is about the health of American oil and gas is related to our national security, is related to really the peace and security of the world. Jeff, maybe you could touch on, at some level, this is just getting American producers better prices for their product. And go ahead and talk about the Brent thing, because we're really now more linked to a global benchmark as opposed to a U.S. benchmark.
Yes, so what we were trying to alleviate when we built the contract on the Gulf Coast was market disruptions, unnecessary volatility, extreme price moves. All of those things I think cause problems for producers and refiners, and planning and investing and generating or raising capital all becomes harder. So the goal, we're in our infancy now, but it's growing rapidly. The goal is to tie Midland WTI, which is a different crude from the WTI that's at Cushing that everyone sees on CNBC. It's a specific grade out of the basin directly into Houston. So that Midland WTI is what's popular internationally, especially with European refiners and Asian refiners. So bringing it to the coast, alleviating some of that volatility, also connecting it to the Brent complex. So all benchmarks have to evolve. The ICE runs we're the biggest energy exchange in the world, so we run benchmarks all over the globe. Some of the biggest crude ones are the Brent crude contract. the Dubai contract in Asia and Murban contract as well. So bringing this Gulf Coast contract onto the same platform with those and allowing the market to trade a transparent instrument that's on the screen and in real time all day, and also it matches the spec that Platts chose to be deliverable into the Brent complex. So you can actually take delivery of the HOU contract and deliver on into the Brent complex. So it just connects our domestic product to the global market, and that's extremely important.
So it's interesting when you think about this as a non-trader, someone who's not in the oil markets every day. If the U.S. has a benchmark which is not as susceptible to volatility, it becomes a predictable benchmark, which means if you are a trader or a purchaser of oil anywhere, you think, tie me to that, because it's more dependable. I think the analogy we came up with a little bit talking ahead of time was sort of similar to the US dollar. Like it is good for the US industry to have something that they can rely on that is dependable, that draws the rest of the world in to transact in that currency.
Yeah, we were talking, Blake brought up a good point. I'm going to give you credit on it, but you said a great thing. When we were here earlier talking about permitting, and Secretary Chow mentioned the word, certainty, permitting certainty. The same argument exists around price. If we're talking about the capital investments that we're talking about, having permitting certainty, but also price certainty means something. And as we go out talking to international customers, it works both ways. It's a great hedge for the American producer for a barrel of crude oil that is actually coming out of the ground, but it's also, to the extent that it's liquid and transparent, to have an international company come in and just hit the buy button. It makes the asset bases and that we operate and the crude that flows on our system more valuable.
Blake, let me ask you if there's anything to add, but also kind of throw in another question. I think the sense that we all have, generally speaking, is that the Texas Gulf Coast is sort of becoming, it's the industrial kind of central place of the planet. So having this benchmark at that place with all that activity that's going on, that has to be, a broader advantage than just what it's doing for E&P companies.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the kind of following up the Brent comment, the ability to cleanly hedge back to the Gulf Coast and tie yourself to producers that are in a very stable geopolitical environment kind of speaks to everything that we've been talking about today, while at the same time having a natural short of all of the refining infrastructure, both in Houston, in Beaumont, and Port Arthur, and further east in Louisiana. Just really bolsters everything that we're talking about right here.
I was going to say, Jeff, I think we've all been used to, certainly in recent years, the differential between Brent and WTI. Now you have WTI Houston is actually part of the Brent formula, so they're just naturally closer together. You just want to talk about that feature?
I think it's the first time that you can actually, in one transaction, hedge your ARB exposure from the Gulf Coast directly into the North Sea market. You can do the same with Midland WTI in the Gulf Coast versus the Dubai market when you're sending crude to Asia. That has multiple benefits. First of all, it's more transparent than it's ever been, and it's accessible, and you can, we're building a data history, and you're seeing, about 5 million barrels a day already getting delivered through the contract. I'm sorry, 5 million barrels a month are being delivered through the contract. But another benefit that is a little bit in the weeds, but when you put a new benchmark onto the global clearing system that we have, where Brent resides and Dubai resides, and a whole group of 700 different OTC oil derivatives on one exchange, and then you bring Midland WTI onto that, we get margin netting against all of those other benchmark positions. You end up paying roughly 5% of what you would to hedge a cargo normally if you were going from NYMEX WTI to Brent, with several steps in between.
I was just thinking, if you're, to kind of put a finer point on this, if you're Russia or if you're China and you look at the development of this, is your fundamental reaction like, well, darn, they figured out a way to get better prices back to their producers, so their oil and gas industry is probably healthier, so I wish they were getting weaker, but Is that the fair way to think about a Xi Jinping or a Putin reaction to the index?
I would hope so. I mean, I will say, I mean, China clearly values having benchmarks and trying to control benchmarks and move the petrodollar. They have the Shanghai Futures Exchange contract, which is the same size, contract size, 1,000 barrel lots. And what we're seeing there is there's all domestic players are forced to trade that contract, and it trades roughly 10 times what the open interest is on the contract. So they're putting a lot of effort into building a contract. We're actually, the HOU contract is already doing better than that Shanghai Futures Exchange contract that's been trading for several years. So I think, it's important that we have benchmarks in the US that we can regulate, that we have oversight into, and that are reflective of the actual risk that the industry has. So I think it's important.
So one question for you, Jeff. If these benchmarks get better, like we're talking about, like the HOU, the efficiency of it, are you sensing in your producing customer base perhaps more interest in hedging? If I know the hedge is a better hedge, does that increase the probability that more barrels will be hedged, and then that may in turn have some positive benefits for the industry broadly? Or is that, maybe am I getting ahead of myself?
Again, it's there's inertia in moving from old instruments. I mean, people have 15 years of risk written against NYMEX WTI, so getting people to move and finding enough value to incite them to move it takes some work. But we're seeing most of the North Sea players are active in HOU already, and we're seeing people utilize the contract to take delivery of the exchange guaranteed spec that can then be delivered into the international contract. So they're using it. It's commercially viable already.
And this is, even though this is relatively new and it's growing, but as a percent of our export barrels, right, this is a pretty high percent is linked to HOU. Do you want to just comment on that?
Yeah, I think, today we're exporting, call it north of 4 million barrels a day. What we see, I think our August was, I was looking at the 180-day average, but it was around 8 million barrels a day trading on the contract. So yeah, I think they're both moving in the right direction.
Yeah, we're seeing positions as 80 million barrels of open interest out to the end of 2025. So people are building this into their plans and taking long-term positions, meaningful size.
And anything, guys, so much of the growth in U.S. production has come out of the Permian. Any comments on the pipelines that we have built from the Permian and why this whole thing kind of fits together quite well?
Yeah, I think, and it's a good point with horizontal drilling the way it was, or it is. In my lifetime working in the crude world, I saw Seaway, which used to be a pipeline that delivered into Cushing, reverse and come to the Gulf Coast. We participated in the Eagle Ford Shale. Again, those barrels going to the Gulf Coast. Enterprise participated in Midland ecosystems as we saw the Permian production grow, and Magellan likewise. And you see that not just between our two companies, but industry-wide. You see Capline reverse, you see DAPL. Again, all these barrels heading towards the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, every major long-haul pipeline infrastructure project over the last 10 years has really been to get barrels closer to the coast, whether it was projects that Magellan and Enterprise did, those that Plains did. That's been the name of the game. So I think that lends itself to say, the contract does make more sense to be in Houston than in Cushing, with the physical barrels bypassing Cushing for the most part.
And I assume you guys, all of you in your own way, have had to, whether it's commercial banks or other trading houses or industrial players or shippers, like you guys have had to spend a lot of time just kind of educating the world on what we've done, what it is, why you can use it, why it makes more sense. You want to talk about just sort of the evangelizing you've had to do a little bit around this?
I had to say we've made several rounds around the country. I'm speaking to people. Like I said, the inertia is a massive thing. Everyone wakes up with the risk that they had on yesterday, no matter what you're trying to innovate on. So it's a challenge to get these things started. But once they're starting, you start to see people taking long-term positions. It really feels like it's getting some good traction there.
Anything you guys would add to that?
Well, I was just going to add, we have spent a lot of time on road shows. The American Gulf Coast Select Committee and a lot of those people, to Blake's point, those are customers on our system, and so we stepped out because we do think this is a better tool for our shippers to use. But then, just trying to get back offices, it's a complicated process to have a new contract in a back office and things like that. So it does take some education.
Sure. The other thing I was just going to throw in is one of the things we accomplished by coming together was connecting Magellan and Enterprise's assets on the Gulf Coast around one spec, which previously hadn't been done either physically or behind any contract. So you can now take or make delivery into either facility and pump the barrels across to where you need them for where you have dock arrangements. So it's added some actual physical liquidity.
Yeah, so not just on the spec, but I think also, look, we stepped out, typically for us to pump barrels between terminals, midstream operators charge a fee typically for something like that. We believed in this enough to step back and say that if you're a buyer of this contract and you find yourself in a terminal that you'd rather be in Magellan's or Enterprise, we'll get the barrels to the right location at no cost.
I think it's been very surprising, at least to me personally, how much demand there actually has been physically for that interchangeability between the two terminals. And the spec allowed that, right? It allowed us to guarantee the customers on each side of our two systems that if they moved back and forth, they were going to get what they expected. And we've seen in excess of 100,000 barrels a day for over a year transitioning between our two terminals, which I didn't expect at all.
So guys, as we wrap up, we've got a couple minutes left, but when you think about this story, sort of physical innovation, really, connecting your sites together, sort of financial innovation, what else do we need to do to the U.S. system, or what could we do? Additional cooperation, additional infrastructure, additional, permitting, what do we need to build? But as you guys think about the system, the plumbing in the US of A, what else can we do to make it better and make it healthier for our industry?
I'll take a first stab at it. For us, we see that export number, call it the 4 million barrels a day, and Amarita, she showed some projections. If you believe this 300 to 500,000 barrel a day year-over-year growth, each of those incremental barrels are going to go to the export market. And when you think about exporting, the most efficient way to export that is on very large crude carriers. And so what we see in the Gulf Coast, anywhere from 30 to 40 of these VLCCs loading every month. And some of those can be partially loaded in Corpus, but there's a group of VLCCs out there that are being reverse lightered. So 3 Aframax ships transloading. And so when you think about, the greenhouse gas emissions of that inefficient operation, the cost of that operation, so at Enterprise, we think there's a better way to do it. We have an offshore port project that will fully load VLCCs, but we think that's the way this should ultimately go.
No, that's great. Blake or Jeff, anything?
No, I agree with what Jay just said there, and there's really 3 of those projects still in the hunt. I think that Jay's is definitely the lead dog at this point, and what I would add to that is just making sure that buyers and sellers have the ability to come together and transact, that producers and refiners can clear barrels with each other. It's been kind of the story over the last 10 years, and I think that the midstream companies will continue to try and make sure that markets don't dislocate and that barrels can transit where they need to go.
Well, look, this is a great story. It's the kind of thing we need to be doing, working together. It's a leadership and cooperation story, and it's something that made American energy better. So can I give a round of applause for Jeff and James and Blake? Thank you, guys. Okay, our final discussion today is American Energy, Global Force for Geopolitical Stability. Our presenter was appointed as the ambassador of the Kingdom of Bahrain to the United States in 2017 by His Majesty King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Sheikh Abdullah bin Rashid Al Khalifa. of the Catherine and Shelby Cullum Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation, please welcome Victoria Coates.
A quick explanatory note. Harold, wonderful to see you. Thank you for including me in this wonderful event. As an ongoing gift from COVID, which I had 3 weeks ago, I have a ruptured blood vessel in my nose, which sometimes starts to bleed. If this happens, I will get up and make a quick exit, and Blue will come on, and he has our questions, and he will ask them. It is not life-threatening, but it's not very pretty. So with that, Ambassador, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to Oklahoma City, to America, as we like to say for those of us who spend too much time in DC, and to talk about this critical topic, which we've discussed many times, which is the role of the United States in global energy security and how we can partner more fulsomely with our traditional allies, particularly in the Gulf, on this critical topic. And I was very struck by some of the statistics. There we go, perfect. The statistics that I heard from Harold, the tripling of US oil production, the quadrupling of US natural gas production, what both Jack and Bob were talking about, the future of natural gas in the United States, what an extraordinary upward trajectory that might be. I'm from Pennsylvania, so I'm a little biased toward the natural gas, but I have nothing against oil. So it's an extraordinary moment for the United States, and I wanted to start our conversation by getting the view from a country like Bahrain in critical neighborhood, looking at your emerging role once again as an energy producer, but how the United States is growing into our status as a global energy superpower. I don't know that we've fully thought it through. And I'm just wondering how an outsider looks in at that, now you know us so well, and how you think we could most productively partner with Bahrain going forward.
Well, first of all, I've got to thank our friend Harold Ham for the kind invitation and the opportunity to be here with all of you this evening in this fabulous building. Victoria, the last time both you and I shared a stage, I was the moderator, and I was asking you the questions. I hope this is not payback, but I truly look forward to this conversation. Obviously, you're talking to the ambassador of a country that has had a very long and deep-rooted relationship with the United States. Something that I've said many times is that Bahrain has chosen sides a very long time ago. And so when we see the US prosper, we feel comforted because we're fully invested in this relationship. And not only that, we realize the integral role that the United States plays in the stability of energy markets throughout the world. We know that politicizing the energy markets and looking at it from the prism of politics and not through supply and demand always complicates things. But we've also seen how the United States has played a very responsible role in ensuring that those markets are progressing and they're headed towards the right direction. And so I think what we're trying to do here is to look at policies in which we can protect our national security interests while also looking out for the best interests of our partners and our allies. And as the United States plays a bigger and bigger role in energy markets, we feel comforted because of this relationship. Obviously, Bahrain has done a lot when it comes to its relationship with the US. How can we double down on what we've been able to achieve thus far is what we're trying to do. When we look at the waterways within the Gulf, and we look at the role that not only the US Navy plays, but also the Bahraini Navy and like-minded countries in securing those waterways. Now, you might think of energy prices, if there's a crisis in the Arabian Gulf, this is going to have a direct impact on global energy prices. And who's going to feel it the most? People around the world that are filling up their gas tanks. And so we have invested in defense, we've invested in relationships that have prospered over time, and we've built out these multiple coalitions to make sure that those waterways are protected, to make sure that global energy prices are stable. And as time goes by, we've seen how the elevation of our commitment toward each other's security has really played an integral role in the security of the entire region.
Now, it's been a fascinating development to watch, and I'm so obsessed with my nose, I forgot to mention at the outset that, it's a great honor to be here representing the Heritage Foundation, along with many of my colleagues, obviously Steve Moore and others are all present here today. But to have Heritage represented to discuss energy as a national security issue is new. And so we were all thrilled by this invitation. And the ability to expand the discussion of security, architecture, which really dates back to 1980 and President Carter. I would give President Reagan a little bit more agency in establishing the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, and all that has transpired from that. And my second question for you, though, has to do with energy as sort of a geostrategic force. And, sort of one of my moments of clarity on this happened in Abu Dhabi in July of 2020, when I was over there as Secretary Briette's special representative for the region, trying to elevate the role of the Department of Energy to our partners and allies. So it was great to see Dan here earlier today, but also just very quietly supporting the Abraham Accords. I would define myself as a therapist. I had many sessions. There was a lot of sort of discussions that were going on. It was a momentous time. But I woke up one morning, and one of the great things about being in Abu Dhabi is you get the Dubai Bloomberg show in real time. So that's what you wake up to. And they were all literally tripping over themselves because Chevron had bought Noble Energy. And I don't know if Mike Wirth is still here, but it was such a bold thing for Chevron to do. But of course, they wouldn't have done it if they didn't have ironclad assurances from Saudi Arabia that was not going to be a problem for them to purchase Israeli assets in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that's when I knew that the Abraham Accords with Bahrain and UAE were very likely to go forward, that this was a clear market signal that this was okay. But in the summer of 2020, you just kind of let Saudi Arabia go unsaid. You didn't actually say the words, you just assumed everybody knew that's what we were talking about. In September of 2023, everyone, including the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, is talking about a potential peace deal between the kingdom and Israel. And I think it is certainly a testimony to the courage of King Hamad, of the Crown Prince, of Sheikh Nasser, of yourself, to have entered into those historic agreements in 2020, that the success of those has led to these very open discussions with Saudi Arabia about what this might look like. And sure, there are a lot of discussions going on, I think, in the kingdom about this, but, and I'm sure there'll be a spectrum of opinions on it. But the fact of the matter is the conversations are happening. So from your perspective, and as much energy as you want to weave into it, I'm sure we'll be curious to see, but what might that deal look like, and how might that impact the region and increase both security, prosperity, and energy security as well?
Well, it goes without saying that the Abraham Accords has really reshifted the landscape of the entire region. It has opened up many possibilities. We're 3 years into it right now, Bilaterally, we have signed over 50 MOUs thus far. Most of the work is being done on a government-to-government level. We have 5 direct flights a week. We have an ambassador in Tel Aviv. We have frequent visits. And now it's transcending the layers of society where the private sector, we're trying to get the private sector to play a more integral role in this. But again, I mean, the start happened 3 years ago. To now see the conversation that Saudi is having, and only recently when His Royal Highness Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was asked, his response was, we get closer every day. And so it's probably not a matter of if, but a matter of when. And when that happens, I think we'll see more and more opportunities open up, opportunities that we have never tried exploiting. And that will really create a shift in mindset. There's obviously the Palestinians that we need to talk about as well. And I think that the negotiations are going on. We're hopeful that we can get ends to meet. But at the end of the day, it seems like the moral compass is pointing towards peace. And that's the important thing. And we're doing all what we can to make sure that the Abraham Accords is successful, to get more and more momentum as time goes by. It's a very exciting chapter. We have done a lot with the Israelis thus far, but I think there's more to come as time goes by.
Well, and I hope you are all rightfully proud of your pioneering role in making this process possible. And sort of along the lines of the energy cooperation question, I know there are a number of other kind of critical relationships between the United States and Bahrain in that sphere that we might not have traditionally considered national security, but now very much are, particularly in the wake of the Ukraine war, emerging as national security issues. And one of those, perhaps most dramatically, is food security. And we've noticed here in Oklahoma, as in my home state of Pennsylvania, Big Ag is a big project. And one of the great strengths of the United States, our ability to feed ourselves, which is something we have defined like defense as a capacity that we're going to be very protective of in the best possible way. And I was just curious if you had any conversations here in Oklahoma, if you learned anything particularly interesting about food security here in this state that could be applicable to Bahrain, and maybe some lines of partnership that might open up in that sphere.
Well, one of the most exciting aspects of my job here in the US is not actually spending time in DC, but going around the country.
Visiting America.
There we go. The whole notion of interacting with folks from other parts of the country, looking at opportunities, has really given us a lot of opportunities to work together. As a matter of fact, when we first launched this initiative at the embassy called Beyond the Beltway, it got us to places where you would usually fly over to get from one part of the country to another. And you get to meet really fascinating people with stories, and all of a sudden there's a delegation that visits and vice versa. And then we see trade, we see relationships, we see friendships that are being developed. Earlier this morning, I had a very productive roundtable with the Secretary of Agriculture and those that represent different industries, all related to food security, because governments around the world recognize the importance of food security within their national security interests. And that's where we are, recalibrating our relationships, the whole notion of friendshoring was a term that came up recently, and so how do we double down on those relationships that have worked in the past? And okay, it might cost us a little bit more, but then the security guarantee that you get from a reliable partner is way more beneficial than one that's not as strong. And it's been a good run so far, and this is my first time here in this great state. I have seen so much potential and a lot of alignment that I look forward to working with some of the entities here in finding win-win situations with entities back home. And you know, we always look at Bahrain. Yes, it's a small country with a very limited economy, but when we look at it as a gateway to the entire region, it brings a whole different level of cooperation and opportunity.
And that actually is a nice lead into my next question, which you could ask how the ambassador to Bahrain came to be here in Oklahoma City. But another interesting question is, why would someone from Oklahoma want to go visit Bahrain? And when I was in Manama in, I guess, November of 2019 for the Security Forum, I was staying at the Le Méridien, which is attached to a Saks Fifth Avenue in downtown. And as I looked at the Saks Fifth Avenue, there was a big placard, and it was wrapped like a Christmas present, and there was a Christmas tree ornament hanging on it. And it said, Black Friday brunch, all you can drink, parentheses, alternative beverages, in case you were wondering. And I turned to my Bahraini counterpart, and I said, let's unwrap this object that we have here and talk about the fact that last time I looked, y'all don't celebrate Thanksgiving. So where's the Black Friday coming from? And he laughed and he said, we love it. It's America. It's you guys love it. We think it's fun. We've gotten to like brunch a lot. We have more relaxed rules here in Bahrain. And I thought, how wonderful. this is not your father's Gulf. And, obviously countries are coming on this trajectory to, at different speeds, and, they have their priorities, but you can feel it all across the region. And it's a huge opportunity from my perspective for the United States. Some of our competitor countries who are active in the region, for example, don't have the same kind of cultural exports that we have. And so just curious to know what you would think if one of our friends from Oklahoma came to Manama, what they would find, what might surprise them, and what the view of America might be.
Well, I think it's always been in the crossroads of civilizations. And I think what you will find in Bahrain is the old and the new. You want to go to an old souk and experience the old way of a market, it's there. You want to go to an ultra high-tech mall that's air-conditioned and all that, it's there. You can do the same when it comes to diving. You can go free diving for pearls, or you can go scuba diving. I think that those options that are there, I was also thinking of racing. You can go and watch one horse race or 1,000 horsepower races with Formula One.
Formula One's coming up in the spring, isn't it?
It is. It's usually the first race on the calendar, which is just great. But many reasons to go to Bahrain. But I think what makes it special is that you can really build friendships with folks that are local and with folks that have chosen Bahrain as their homes. And that you sometimes don't get in other parts of the world. And so I feel like a salesman, but honestly, it's a special place, and you'll only know how special it is once you visit it for the first time.
And then I have a couple of questions in our remaining moments about some maybe more serious national security issues. The first has to do with the very high-level signing that recently took place in Washington with the Crown Prince and Sheikh Nasser visiting. And, with my history of partisan hackery, I'm not going to pretend that I'm not a conservative, But at the same time, I'm not in the business of bashing our current leadership when they do something that I think is smart. And this certainly built on a lot of the conversations that we had started, which is great to know that they didn't throw all of that out just reflexively, but decided the idea that this kind of formal security trade agreement with Bahrain was a good idea. Can you talk a little bit about the agreement, what it means, and how it might be a model like the Abraham Accords for other countries going forward?
Well, these past 2 weeks, we had the opportunity of signing a historic agreement with the United States. Historically, we have had a defense cooperation agreement, but this new agreement called CICIPA, the Comprehensive Security Integration and Prosperity Agreement, is one that really elevates the defense and security commitments that both countries have towards each other. But the interesting part, and I bring it up today, is because we've added the element of prosperity to it. And so, what is prosperity? It's opportunities in the private sector, it's incentivizing US businesses to set up shop in Bahrain. Now, all of that was done over many years. You know, we're talking about a country that has pegged its currency to the US dollar. We have signed a free trade agreement a very long time ago where we've been able to double our exports to the US in the first 10 years, and the US has been able to triple its exports to Bahrain. What we have done is we've allocated a plot of land that is now used as a free trade zone right next to the ports. We came up with a policy to ensure that there's less than 2-hour transit time for commodities coming to Bahrain, either by air or sea. And so all of these different initiatives culminate in this idea of a new security framework that includes prosperity to it. And honestly, I think that this becomes the new status quo for the entire region. I think that the United States will be looking at other countries to join. It's an open-ended agreement. And we are currently looking at quick wins. It will gain momentum as time goes by. We'll hopefully have other countries that will add to the mix and then come up with different initiatives like the one that was announced, when was it?
The G20.
Exactly, exactly. So all of these multilateral efforts are creating opportunities for American businesses to flourish in a region that is moving forward with full steam.
Now, and the agreement at the G20, I'm sure everybody took note of it, is basically going from India up to the Eastern Mediterranean, a new railway corridor is a good word, but with various transportation tracks to move people and goods expeditiously through the region. It is a wonderful, wonderful idea. I think hopefully a lot of American companies, Oklahoma companies, will bid on projects and be part of building out that infrastructure, because the alternative bidder is in none of our best interests. So there's one problem, though, in all of this. One of my favorite topics in the region, because they seem to take a personal interest in me, as they do in Bahrain, which would be our Iranian friends, because for all of this to work, you're going to have the free flow of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which obviously they hold at risk. It's going to have to go up into the Red Sea through Bab al-Mandeb, which they also hold at risk through their Houthi proxies in Yemen. And while they have been making some reasonable noises, particularly toward the Chinese and a little bit toward the Saudis recently, a lot of their actions, between supplying masses of killer drones to the Russians to use against the Ukrainians. They're even talking about building a drone factory in Russia to supply these, and then selling, someone mentioned earlier today, putting up with 1 million barrels of illicit exports to China of cheap oil. You know, these are not the acts of a country that seeks regional peace. And, you know, given their historic meddling in Bahrain, given Bahrain's position almost, you know, in literally the middle of one of the hottest areas, I'd just be curious on your views on how Iran goes forward, how real the civil unrest is within the country, you know, how much can be done from the outside countries that want to partner with the people of Iran, want to see. I mean, for those of us who are old enough to remember when Iran was a friend, this is not a historic impossibility. I would say unlikely under current leadership, but not impossible. So, you know, that kind of elephant in the living room, as we're talking about all these peace deals, is what do the Iranians do to disrupt it?
No, this is a very interesting and important point because, as you very clearly stated, we have been on the receiving end of those malign activities for many years now. And what we've been able to do is work with partners, especially the United States, in raising our deterrence, while at the same time being cognizant of the fact that any political decisions that are being taken are taken in a way where it will lead to de-escalation. Any escalation in the region is going to negatively affect all of us. So thankfully, we've been able to contain that. The U.S. Navy is trying out innovative ways in which you reduce the risk on your personnel. Like take, for example, the unmanned vessels that are navigating the Arabian Gulf these days within Task Force 59. This is a truly innovative approach that has been only possible because of the U.S.'s Navy presence in Bahrain. So I think we're in this together. We need to contain this behavior, and we've been somewhat successful because we've been able to keep the lanes open. There's no doubt that there's a huge target on our backs, but we've been able to manage it properly and in a way that it reduces the risks on our development in country. So we're the only country that has not established relations with the Iranians thus far for the exact same reason. We are very careful, and we will stay committed to the cause of protecting our waterways and keeping them open.
And just finally, in our last remaining seconds, do you have a view from Bahrain on a potential second nuclear agreement with Iran and the desirability of that or the feasibility of it?
The JCPOA is, it's a very touchy subject. It's one that we have not understood. We do believe that the ambition is long-term ambition, and even if there was another agreement, the final objective is still going to stay the same. They're going to push towards it while getting a carte blanche on everything else that the Iranians are doing in the entire region. But again, we have to be very vigilant. We have to monitor their actions within the terrorist networks in the entire region. And we know that we couldn't do it on our own. And so working with partners, making sure that we're minimizing the risks on our economies, while at the same time moving full on when it comes to our development and working with partners to get there is what we're focused on right now.
Well, thank you, Sheikh Abdullah. I think that's precisely why it's so critical for us to have this opportunity to hear from such a strong partner in the region, what your perspective is. You're on the front lines. So I know I speak for all of us. We very much appreciate your presence here today, your friendship, and look forward to expanding that partnership both with Oklahoma and with the United States more broadly, and we're going to tempt you to Pennsylvania. So I hope nobody here is a Tampa Bay fan, because then we might have words at the reception.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you, Victoria, for that. That was fantastic. So just a couple of things as we wrap up. Please join us on the 4th floor. We do have a reception. Come talk about it, kick it around, meet some of the people that you heard and saw here today. 4th floor, and we want to thank Merit Advisors again for being our sponsor. Also, if you would, there's a survey right on the table. If you haven't filled it out, please do take a couple minutes. Just leave it right on the table. We'll grab it. We're going to wrap up, and there's no better person to wrap this up than Harold Hamm. His book is The Game Changer. Today, he is a game changer, but he's also our closer. So can I get a round of applause for Harold?
Thanks, Maynard. Hope you found today as insightful and inspiring as I did. I told you we'd have some fun, and we have. We've learned a whole lot. We've discovered, and I learned a great deal today. Just want to express a couple thoughts to you. I know that everybody kind of wondered if I was reaching when I said that, our energy independence in America means world peace. And I think you saw that from the Bahraini ambassador. It certainly does mean world peace. This couldn't have happened. You wouldn't have had the Abraham Accord if it didn't happen. So anyway, I just want to wind up saying thank you. It was a great day. Thank you for lasting it out. Yeah. I think I'm standing here between y'all and a drink, so I'm not going to stand here very long. So anyway, that's the best deals upstairs. But, I've heard that, America was in relative decline. We heard that recently. And it discouraged me. It discouraged me greatly. And if we're not recognized, we have a government that doesn't recognize this industry, certainly we're going to be in relative decline in the eyes of the world. So we have to change that. So it's incumbent upon each of us. Let's disperse what we've learned here today. Let's take that with us. I've learned so much. LNG, it's not it's a destination fuel. I learned that. I learned what we've done for the rest of the world with LNG, all these things. So anyway, we've got a great deal of information that we can disperse and lift this industry up where it should be. So thank you for attending. Thank all the presenters. I just thought it was terrific, and all the people that came and participated with us. It's just been tremendous. So thank you very much.
Please join us on the 4th floor for a reception sponsored by Merit Advisors.